The stars are right, and that means it's time for another episode of The Whisper in Darkness. I'm your host, the man from Lang. Thank you very much for joining me today. On this episode, I am bringing you another installment of In the Know, a series of videos for players who are new to the Arkham Horror LCG. This is part 3 of a beginner's guide to timing and player windows. This video examines the steps and player windows of the final 3 phases of the game, those being Enemy, Upkeep, and Mythos. It concludes with a few tips and tricks that you can use to exploit player windows during your battle against the evil cultists and strange alien entities that you will encounter over your course of your adventures. As with the previous episodes of In the Know, I've tried to keep spoilers to a minimum. However, this episode does feature examples from scenarios in the core set campaign, The Night of the Zealot. Most of the cards featured in this video are from the core set, however, I do discuss several cards that are only available in expansions toward the end. If you enjoy what you hear, remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Part 2 left Roland and Agnes hanging in the investigation phase, so let's pick up where we left off and look at the enemy phase. The enemy phase has 4 steps and at least 2 player windows. The first step, 3.1, marks the beginning of the enemy phase. Effects that trigger at the beginning of the phase or at the beginning of the enemy phase would do so now. Mind Wipe is an example of this type of effect, which are quite rare in the core set. Cards that trigger at the beginning of the enemy phase are more common in expansions, although not by much. More often than not, you will simply acknowledge the beginning of the enemy phase and then move on to step 3.2, when each ready, unengaged enemy with the Hunter keyword will move. Enemies with the Hunter keyword, such as the Swarm of Rats, are quite common. The key thing to remember here is that the enemy must be ready and unengaged. It's also important to keep in mind that the Hunter enemy always moves to the closest investigator. If 2 investigators are equidistant, the Hunter will move to the investigator that best meets its prey instructions, if any. If the Hunter does not have prey instructions, the lead investigator gets to choose where that enemy will move. If you're unfamiliar with the rules for Hunter movement, do check out the first installment of In the Know, Enemy Engagement, which explains this in much more detail and provides some examples of it as well. After Hunter enemies move, the first player window of the phase opens. This player window is followed by step 3.3, during which players resolve engaged enemy attacks in player order. Once a player resolves engaged enemy attacks, you return to the previous player window before the next investigator resolves engaged enemy attacks. Once all investigators have resolved engaged enemy attacks, there is a final player window before they proceed to step 3.4, which signals the end of the enemy phase. Let's return to our game featuring Roland and Agnes to see how this works in practice. If Roland and Agnes failed to defeat the ghouls during the previous investigation phase, they'll have to deal with them during the enemy phase. After the enemy phase begins, enemies with the Hunter keyword move. However, there are no such enemies in play, so Roland and Agnes proceed to the first player window. If Beat Cop is still in play, Roland can discard it now to inflict 1 damage on a ghoul. If Forbidden Knowledge is ready, Agnes can use it in combination with her response to deal 1 damage to a ghoul. If the investigators inflicted some damage on the ghouls during the investigation phase, this damage may be enough to kill them before they attack, which would be great. Agnes could also trigger the Arcane Initiate to search the top 3 cards of her deck for a spell that may help repel the ghoul's attack. If neither investigator uses their free triggered abilities, they proceed to step 3.3. Roland resolves the Ravenous Ghoul's attack first, since he's the lead investigator. After the Ravenous Ghoul attacks Roland, another player window opens, giving the players a chance to react. Once the players pass, they return to step 3.3 so Agnes can resolve the Ghoul Minion's attack. If Agnes hasn't triggered a response this phase, she could do it now to inflict another damage on the Ghoul, killing it. After the Ghoul Minion attacks, another player window opens. Once the investigators pass, they advance to step 3.4, at which point the enemy phase ends. The player windows that open during the enemy phase are more difficult to exploit than those that open during the investigation phase. There's a simple reason for this. Most of the cards with free triggered abilities or the fast keyword come with a big limitation. You can only play them during your turn. This limitation really puts a damper on your ability to abuse them during player windows that open during the enemy phase. If you're playing in a core set only environment, for example, I counted only 5 cards that you can use during either player window during this phase. Arcane Initiate, both levels of Beat Cop, Forbidden Knowledge, Hospital Debts, and Stray Cat. Now obviously some of those cards are going to be more useful during the enemy phase than others. For example, if an enemy with the Hunter keyword, such as a swarm of rats, moves to your location, you could kill it during the following player window using Beat Cop, or you could use a Stray Cat to automatically evade it and get out of it attacking you. Once the enemy phase is complete, the investigators advance to the final phase of the round, the upkeep phase. The upkeep phase has 6 steps and 1 player window, which opens immediately after step 4.1, which signals the beginning of the upkeep phase. This player window is important because it's your last chance to use free triggered abilities or advance the act deck before the end of the round. For example, this is the final opportunity for Roland to discard his Beat Cop before the round ends. Likewise, this is Agnes's last chance to exhaust Arcane Initiate or Forbidden Knowledge before she readies all exhausted cards during step 4.3 and the round ends. Much like the player windows that open during the enemy phase, this player window is difficult to exploit since there are very few cards that you may trigger at this time. Once this player window closes, the upkeep phase typically ends very quickly as the players complete the following mandatory steps one at a time. During step 4.2, players flip their investigator mini cards back to their colored side so they're ready to take actions the following round. Then they ready all exhausted cards during step 4.3, and this includes any encounter cards that are in play, including enemies. After they ready all exhausted cards, they advance to step 4.4, where in player order each investigator draws 1 card and then gains 1 resource. During step 4.5, in player order each investigator checks their hand size, discarding down to 8 cards if necessary. Finally, the upkeep phase ends during step 4.6. This step also signals the end of the round, so any effects that trigger at the end of the round do so now. Finally, we come to the Mythos phase. Technically, the Mythos phase is the first phase of the round, however, you skip it during the first round of the game, so it makes sense to deal with it last. The Mythos phase has 5 steps and at least 1 player window, which opens immediately after each investigator draws an encounter card, but before the Mythos phase ends during step 1.5. I say there is at least 1 player window because investigators often perform skill tests during the Mythos phase as the result of drawing encounter cards. For example, if an investigator draws Rotting Remains, a treachery card, a willpower skill test begins during the Mythos phase. As we know, there are 2 player windows that open during skill tests, one immediately after the skill test begins, and one after players commit cards from their hand to the skill test. These player windows give investigators a chance to play cards and trigger abilities before a player window opens between step 1.4 and 1.5 of the Mythos phase. These player windows can be important in multiplayer since they give investigators a chance to use free triggered abilities, play cards with the fast keyword, and advance the act deck between encounter cards, which is something they typically can't do. However, the player window that opens during skill tests are much more difficult to leverage during the Mythos phase than the investigation phase, since there are fewer cards and abilities that may trigger at this time. As I mentioned earlier, the Mythos phase has 5 steps. Step 1.1 signals the beginning of the round and the beginning of the Mythos phase. Any cards that trigger at the beginning of the round or at the beginning of the Mythos phase would do so now. During steps 1.2 and 1.3, players place 1 Doom on the current agenda card and then compare the total number of Doom in play with the Doom threshold of the current agenda. If the number of Doom in play meets or exceeds that Doom threshold, they advance the current agenda. During step 1.4, in player order, each investigator draws the top card of the encounter deck and resolves it according to its card type. Now, most of the time, you're going to draw either an enemy or a treachery, although there are a few exceptions. If the card is an enemy, such as an icy ghoul, it spawns according to its spawn instructions. If the enemy has no spawn instructions, it spawns engaged with the investigator that drew the card. If the card is a treachery, such as Rotting Remains, resolve its effect and then place it in the discard pile or your threat area, depending on its game text. If the card that you draw has the Surge keyword, you're in luck. You get to draw another encounter card this turn. I believe my current record for Surge is 4 cards, so I hope you never have to deal with that. The first player window of the phase opens after each investigator draws and resolves an encounter card during step 1.4, but before the Mythos phase ends during step 1.5. Let's catch up with Roland and Agnes to get a better idea how to resolve the Mythos phase and review how to perform a skill test during that phase. We'll assume that Roland and Agnes defeated the nasty ghouls during the investigation phase, and it's step 1.1 of the Mythos phase, which also signals the beginning of the third round. During steps 1.2 and 1.3, Roland and Agnes place 1 Doom token on the current agenda, and then compare the total number of Doom in play with the Doom threshold of the current agenda. There are 3 Doom in play, 2 on the agenda and 1 on the Arcane Initiate. The Doom threshold of the agenda is also 3. That means Roland and Agnes will remove all Doom in play, including the Doom on the Arcane Initiate, and advance the agenda. The investigators will resolve the game text on the back of that agenda card and then place the next agenda card, Rise of the Ghouls, in play. After Roland and Agnes have advanced the agenda, each of them will draw 1 encounter card. Roland draws first since he's the lead investigator, followed by Agnes. Roland draws the card Rotting Remains. It's a treachery that forces the investigator to make a Willpower 3 skill test. If Roland fails the test, he will suffer 1 horror for each point he fails by. Since Roland drew Rotting Remains, he must make a skill test, which is nested within the Mythos phase. During step 1, Roland determines that he is making a Willpower skill test, and that test formally begins. Then a player window opens, which Roland decides to pass. During step 1.2, Roland and Agnes may commit cards from their hands to the skill test. Roland doesn't have any cards with Willpower skill icons in his hand, but Agnes does have an extra copy of Holy Rosary, which she commits to the skill test, raising Roland's Willpower skill value to 4. Neither player would like to commit any more cards to the skill test, so they move on to the next player window. Roland wants to improve his odds of passing the skill test, so he uses the free triggered ability on physical training, spending 1 resource to boost his Willpower skill value to 5. Satisfied, Roland advances to step 3 to draw a Chaos token. Now at this point going forward, Roland cannot play cards or trigger abilities until the skill test is complete, unless those cards or abilities specifically refer to one of those steps. Roland draws a -3. Man, the Chaos bag is really giving Roland and Agnes a rough ride this game. The Chaos symbol does not have an effect during step 4, so he advances to step 5 and determines his modified skill value, which is 2. Roland determines he failed the skill test by 1 during step 6, so he applies the skill test results during step 7, taking 1 horror. Once the skill test ends, the players return to step 1.4 of the Mythos phase, so Agnes can draw and resolve her encounter card. Let's say Agnes draws an Icy Ghoul. Agnes checks to see whether the Icy Ghoul has any spawn instructions, which it does. The Icy Ghoul spawn instructions indicate that it spawns in the cellar. However, the cellar is not in play, so the Icy Ghoul won't spawn. It's about time that Roland and Agnes caught a break this scenario. After Agnes discards the Icy Ghoul, another player window opens, giving the investigators 1 more chance to use free-triggered abilities, play cards with the fast keyword, or advance the act deck before the Mythos phase ends during step 1.5. Agnes, for example, could trigger the Arcane Initiate to search the top 3 cards of her deck for a spell, or she could trigger Forbidden Knowledge to gain 1 resource and take 1 horror. That concludes my look at the phases, steps, and player windows that occur during a round of the Arkham Horror LCG. When players start the game, they advance through the phases sequentially, beginning with the investigation phase. Once the first round is complete, they will advance through the phases sequentially, beginning with the Mythos phase. The Mythos phase has 5 steps and 1 player window. However, additional player windows may open during skill tests, which may begin as a result of investigators drawing encounter cards during step 1.4. The investigation phase has 3 steps, 2 sub-steps, and at least 2 player windows. Additional player windows open after each action taken by an investigator, or if the investigator takes an action that results in a skill test. Most free-triggered abilities and assets or events with the fast keyword may be used during the investigation phase. The investigation phase also has the most player windows of any phase of the game. After the investigation phase, player windows are few and far between. The enemy phase has 4 steps and at least 2 player windows. The exact number of player windows depends on the number of investigators in the game, since a player window opens after each investigator resolves engaged enemy attacks. The player windows that open during the enemy phase are more difficult to exploit than those that open during the investigation phase, since there are relatively few free-triggered abilities or cards with the fast keyword that may be used during this phase. Keep in mind, however, that you may also advance the act deck during any player window during this phase. This can be advantageous, especially if you expect an enemy to spawn as a result of advancing the act deck. If an enemy spawns and it has the hunter keyword, it won't move, since step 1.2, when hunter enemies move, has already passed by the time the player window arrives. The upkeep phase has 6 steps and 1 player window. Much like the player window that opens during the enemy phase, this player window is difficult to exploit since there are relatively few free-triggered abilities or cards with the fast keyword that may be used during this phase. This player window is your last chance to use free-triggered abilities, play cards with the fast keyword, or advance the act deck before the round ends. Finally, there are skill tests, which are usually nested in the Mythos or investigation phases. While not a phase per se, a skill test has 8 steps and 2 player windows. The 2 player windows that open during a skill test are among the most important in the game because they allow investigators to play cards earlier than they otherwise could during the Mythos phase. They also give players a lot of opportunities to manipulate their skill values before they pull a Chaos token from the Chaos bag. Now that you've got a better understanding of the Arkham Horror LCG's timing structure and player windows, you're probably eager to exploit them. Clever players have found all sorts of interesting ways to leverage player windows that are not immediately obvious. Before I wrap up this video, I'd like to take a look at a few of them and share a few of those tricks with you. The first trick is one that I've already hinted at in my examples. An investigator may exhaust Forbidden Knowledge, a mystic asset from the core set, and take 1 horror to move 1 secret from Forbidden Knowledge to his or her resource pool as a resource. If that investigator happens to be Agnes Baker, she may trigger her response when she takes that horror to deal 1 damage to an enemy at her location. This combination lets Agnes deal damage to an enemy during any player window during any phase, which is extremely powerful. Cryptic Research, a seeker event with the fast keyword, lets you choose an investigator at your location and that investigator draws 3 cards. Now, you must play Cryptic Research during a player window during your turn. However, that includes the 2 player windows that open during skill tests on your turn. If you really need to pass a skill test, you can play Cryptic Research during the first player window that opens during a skill test to draw 3 cards, in the hope that 1 or more of those cards will have matching skill icons. For the test, then you may commit 1 or more of those cards from your hand to the skill test during the next step. Once you've picked up a few expansions, your options to abuse player windows increase. Rex Murphy, an investigator released in the Dunwich Legacy expansion, is very good at exploiting Shortcut and Pathfinder, 2 seeker cards that were released during that cycle, that have free triggered abilities or the fast keyword. If Rex Murphy takes an investigate action at one location, he may play shortcut or use Pathfinder during one of the player windows that opens during the skill test to move to a connecting location. If Rex succeeds by 2 or more, he may trigger his response during Step 6 to discover a clue at that location. When the investigate action resolves during Step 7, Rex will also discover a clue at his former location, since that is where he initiated the skill test. Discovering 2 clues at 2 different locations with one action is a great way to speed up your tempo. It's no wonder Rex is one of the most powerful investigators in the game. Speaking of movement during skill tests on your turn, I would be remiss if I failed to mention one of my favorite cards in the game, Elusive, a rogue event with the fast keyword from the core set. Elusive lets an investigator disengage from each enemy engaged with him or her and move to a revealed location with no enemies. You could take an investigate action at one location and then play Elusive during either player window during the skill test to move to another location. However, much like Rex Murphy, you would still discover a clue at the former location since that's where you initiated the skill test. Now, it may seem counterintuitive, but you can pull off the same trick if you take a fight or evade action against an enemy and then play Elusive to move away. If the skill test is successful, you will still damage or evade the enemy, even though your investigator is no longer at that location. I won't spoil it for you, but there is at least one scenario where this type of trick comes in extremely handy. Joey the Rat Vigil, a rogue asset, hasn't received a lot of love from players since he was released in Where Doom Awaits, but he has one of those rare free-triggered abilities like Beat Cop that you can use during any player window. His ability lets you spend 1 resource to choose an item asset from your hand and play it, paying its cost, during any player window. If your investigator is low on health or sanity and then draws a potentially fatal card, such as Rotting Remains during the Mythos phase, you could trigger the rat during either player window of the resulting skill test to play an item to absorb the damage or horror that you expect to take. If you fail the skill test, Joey's item could be the difference between survival and defeat. Alyssa Graham, a mystic asset released during the Undimensioned and Unseen, has a free triggered ability that lets you exhaust her to look at the top card of either the encounter deck or any player deck. You may then add 1 Doom to Alyssa Graham to place the looked at card on the bottom of its deck. Now, typically, your last chance to use Alyssa before you draw an encounter card is the player window of the previous upkeep phase. However, if you're playing multiplayer and another investigator draws an encounter card during the Mythos phase that requires a skill test before you draw your encounter card, you may trigger Alyssa during either player window of that test to rig the next draw in your favor. Triggering Alyssa during one of these player windows has another big advantage. If you decide to add a Doom to place the looked at card on the bottom of the deck, the Doom is placed after you have compared the number of Doom in play to the Doom threshold of the agenda, which means the Doom won't cause the agenda to advance. Unlike if you used Alyssa during the upkeep phase and placed that Doom, which may cause the agenda deck to advance during the following Mythos phase. Finally, there's Lola Hayes, an investigator released in the Path to Carcosa. Now, Lola is one of my favorite investigators in the game, but you really need to have a good grasp of player windows to play her due to her abilities. Lola may play cards from any class. However, there's a catch. After Lola draws her opening hand, she has to pick a role. She can only play, commit, or trigger abilities or neutral cards of that role. So if you start the game and you choose Guardian, you can only play cards that are Guardian cards until you switch roles. Fortunately, Lola has a free triggered ability that lets her switch roles once per round. Knowing when to use that free triggered ability is really key to playing her well. For example, if Lola's current role is Survivor and she's armed with a baseball bat, she can't take a fight action with the baseball bat and then commit a card like Vicious Blow to the skill test, since she can't play cards from 2 different roles. Or can she? If Lola takes a fight action with the baseball bat, she can use her free triggered ability during the first player window of the skill test to switch her role to Guardian. Then she can commit the vicious blow to the skill test during step 2, when you commit cards from your hand to the skill test. Lola won't be able to take another fight action with the baseball bat that round, barring any other role switching shenanigans, since she is a Guardian now. However, she may not need to if she can kill that enemy in one shot. Those are just a few of the tricks that you can pull off with free triggered abilities and player windows. If you'd like more information about player windows and other tips and tricks, I highly recommend that you visit the Strange Solution, a blog dedicated to the Arkham Horror LCG. Modex has done a 2-part episode about player windows that is a great read, and it contains even more tips and tricks for using and abusing player windows, and you can find it at the address on your screen. That's going to do it for my beginner's guide to timing and player windows. Let me know in the comments if you found this video useful. I've got several more ideas for videos in this series, so if there are any topics that you would like me to tackle, leave a comment down below, or you can contact me directly using the email address in the video's description. As always, thank you for watching. That's going to do it for me today. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you like, comment, and subscribe. If you need to contact me, I can be reached at manfromlang@gmail.com. I'm also on Twitter at manfromlang. Until the stars are right, keep your shotgun close and your elder sign closer. Take care out there, and happy investigating.